So I'm excited about our next presentation. We're going from the boreal forest to the barren grounds. Frank was going to give us a little 1,800-kilometer wilderness odyssey here. I'm an ardent admirer of our next presentation, his trips, his articles, and his films, which focus on nature, the North, and human-powered travel. Born and raised right here in Toronto, Frank Wolf floated around in his first canoe on the crystal waters of Georgian Bay. He grew up slowly, but surely, and he drifted away from his true calling as he wandered this concrete wilderness of this city. Frank found his home when he and a friend became the first to paddle 8,000 kilometers across Canada in a single season. This seminal event, for better or worse, set Frank on a life of rich poverty in the outdoors. Scraping out a living of writing, filmmaking, and retail jobs, Frank has spent over 2 joyful decades since that fateful journey, exploring Canada and elsewhere by canoe, kayak, ski, bicycle, and on foot. If you take one item from the boreal forest to the bare grounds, make sure you take a t-shirt, also known as the Frank Wolf Custom Buff. Please welcome Frank Wolf.
Thank you. All right, is this working? Check. Is that my voice? Is that working? Yeah, okay, good. I'm just talking to myself, so I was like, all right. Oh, there it is. Oh, there we go. Check, 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 check. Yeah? All right, okay, good. Okay, we'll get right into it. This is a map of my, kind of the lines of the map. This is kind of my life's mission to slowly fill in all the blank spaces in the wilderness areas of Canada, North America, and elsewhere. And I kind of, when I do my journeys, I keep it very simple, and I try to use the kind of best tool for the job. It's not always the canoe, but generally in Canada it often is. Kayak is a great way to get around. I did a circumnavigation of the Haida Gwaii archipelago back in 2005. Cycled the, it is pretty dark actually, eh? Cycled the Yukon River, 2,000 kilometers in the wintertime, following in the trails of a couple of gold miners from 100 years ago. From Dawson to Nome. And afoot is a great way to get around on foot. This is a journey from 2010 when I followed basically the GPS track of the Northern Gateway pipeline. It was a pipeline that was recently shut down, but we did a film just kind of talking to people along the way about how the pipeline would affect them and the wilderness around them. Of course, you don't stop tripping in the winter times. Go out on skis a lot, lots of backcountry touring. I live out in the West Coast. This is actually from Banff National Park a couple of years ago, where I joined a biologist, and we did a mammal tracking survey for a week, collecting camera trap cards and actually counting mammal tracks along the way to kind of see how many critters were in the area. It's kind of a year-to-year survey they do there. And pack rafting is something I'm doing more recently. A great way if you're doing a ski traverse or a hike through the mountains in BC or Alaska. You can carry these little 5-6 pound rafts with you, inflate them, and paddle your way out to the ocean afterwards. And ridiculously, and probably the worst tool for the job in the Northwest Passage, we tried to row it. It didn't work out that well, but that $100,000 boat is the most expensive craft I've ever tried to do a trip with, and it was probably the least efficient possible craft to use. But anyways, we're here to talk about the canoe, and the canoe is the best way to travel in most parts of Canada. Definitely, if you look at the Canadian map, the hydrology map, you can see the. So this is there's kind of a line here from Lake Winnipeg all the way up through Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, and everything all the way over to the east and the north is, of course, the Shield. And you have this amazing matrix of waterways where you can go upstream, downstream, portage. There's an area around Lake Winnipeg I've been through several times. And so the canoe is definitely the most efficient way to get through a lot of the areas of Canada that are really the most kind of wilderness remote areas. And I started quite young, as was mentioned in the opening, as myself and my sister in the early 70s on Georgian Bay in the old Sports Pal. People here probably have a Sports Pal under their cottage. You still see them around. But yeah, so kind of was, my parents were immigrants and they came to Canada kind of to spend time in the north. And so I got into it and I got really, hooked on tripping. And the thing I love about canoe tripping is the freedom. You're kind of like your own society out there. No one can tell you what to do when you're on a canoe trip. You're the king of the world. Like, your whole world is that canoe, your partner, and yourself, and like thousands of kilometers and weeks of journeying. And also the great thing about traveling in Canada is that one thing I never do, I never repeat myself on my journeys. I never go to the same place again twice, because there's so much to explore. And when you're on a trip, you're doing something new every day. Every day is different. Like that cliff, that's the first and the last time I'm going to jump off that cliff. That kind of corner in the lake there, that's the first and last time I'll see that corner of the lake. And we're seeing something, you realize you're seeing something for the first and the last time ever. It's a very immediate way to live. And so it just is addictive, and it's kind of an anarchistic, beautiful way of existing. So I keep on going back to it again and again and again, as you can see. So what got me hooked in, as mentioned, was my cross-Canada canoe trip back in 1995, starting here at number 1, just kind of a southern route, ending up in Vancouver, starting in St. John's, 171 days, 8,000 kilometers. I was 24 years old, kind of full of vigor, and really got into this is us on the Grand Portage, myself and my partner Roman at the time. And ever since then, I've just kept on going now for 20 plus years. The thing about going on these journeys, though, of course, is that you start to run out of partners. People get married, they get jobs, they have lives that take them away from canoe tripping, and I just kind of keep on going. So you can't always get someone who's experienced in canoe. I don't look necessarily for the most experienced canoeist. I look for someone who's got the right attitude about being in the wilderness, who enjoys it as much as I do, and who's going to be comfortable in that kind of a setting. So I kind of look for, definitely attitude is everything, so I look for in a partner. So, and the great thing also about picking people who don't know anything about canoe tripping, you can tell them anything and they'll believe you. So you can just make up stuff, and this is how we do it in canoe trip. This is the way it is, and so you get various people, and you get them into certain situations. This is my friend Taku. He had never been on a canoe trip before. And I said, Taku, I'm going to do the 75-day, 3,000 kilometer canoe trip across northern Manitoba and Ontario. How would you like to join along? He said, yeah, sure, sounds good. And I said, oh, and by the way, I was kind of working on efficiencies in tripping, so I thought, I just want to go over all my portages on this journey once without doubling back. So in order to do that, I cut the food down, right down to the thins. So I told Taku, I said, we don't actually have lunches on canoe trip. No one eats lunch on canoe trip. So, and Taku, attitude is everything. He's okay, I got it. So just a little bit of oatmeal and coffee in the morning, a little handful of snacks for the day, and we don't stop, we just keep going, and then have a little bag of freeze-dried food in the evening for dinner. And that's it, and some tea maybe if you're lucky. And he said, okay, but so here we are on day 50, the first time looking in a mirror, we got into a motel in Smooth Rock Falls, and we looked in the mirror and said, wow, we've lost a bit of weight here. It was kind of like, this isn't the Jenny Craig program, it's a Frank program. And so Taku started the trip at 145, he dropped down to 125 here by day 50. I started off at, got some soundtrack music. Do you hear that? Oh, Michael, your presentation is done. There's the timer, yeah. Sorry, I just heard the alarm. It's off, I got it, yeah. So on day 50, we look in the mirror, I went from 180 down to 155. And then to Taku's delight, I reinstalled lunches at that moment. So for the last 25 days of the trip, we had lunch, and he was even happier than he'd been. But no matter what, no matter how hard the times were, no matter how much our stomachs were growling, it was still a good time. He had the attitude. The attitude is key when you're hunting for partners. So you don't need the experience, you just need the attitude. And so my victim or partner for this trip I'm going to talk about is Sean Campbell. So Sean on the left here. And Sean and I, we did several backcountry canoe trips together, but he'd only done like a 7-day trip on the Bowen Lakes, kind of him and like 5 women with a lot of booze. And that was his experience canoeing. So we went on a trip though just to work out the kinks. We did a 10-day pack rafting and hiking journey through the Spitsizi Wilderness in northern BC. Got along great. And I said, all right, Sean, next year, how about a 45-day, 1,800K trip from L'Orange up to Baker Lake? And so the reason I chose this route particularly is I kind of want to do something that was kind of an equal blend of both the Barren Grounds and the Boreal in one. Thus the name Masquananook. Masqua is the Cree word for bear, and they're the boreal forest indigenous people, of course. Nanook, the Inuit word for bear, and they're the barren ground representation. So equal amount of time in the beautiful boreal, and then the lovely barren grounds. And so we began in Larange, Saskatchewan, which is just where the Canadian Shield starts in Saskatchewan. And there's Sean and I on the dock in Larange. And this canoe here is the first kind of T4MX boat to be put through a proper expedition test. We were kind of guinea pigs. And Iskif has supported me with the canoes over the years and said, hey, Frank, we've got this new material. Royal X is gone. We're making them out of T4MX. Take it away. So they didn't even put any skid plates on for the bow and the stern just so we could really beat it up. And so we headed off into the lovely boreal forest. And I like to bring a bit of reading material for my journey. And so Sleeping Island, you guys are probably familiar with this book by P.G. Downes. We followed much of his route through the boreal forest in the first half of our journey. P.G. Downes was a teacher from Boston in the 1930s, and he used to come up into Saskatchewan, Manitoba area and travel with the indigenous people there and the locals, just kind of joining them on their canoe journeys, ambling about the landscape. So a great way to inform our journey. So you can see kind of how the geography here, kind of this is where people always think Saskatchewan, of course, is the flat plains, wheat fields. But once you get to Larange and north, you can see the relief and the amazing, spectacular paddling possibilities as good as anywhere else. Our journey would start on the Churchill and Reindeer rivers up to Reindeer Lake. And it's a good way to get into the groove of things, beautiful boreal sunsets. This is Nestowiak Falls, which is actually the largest set of falls in Saskatchewan. And I remember this particular campsite for myself. I'd had a bit of an injury in my thumb going into the journey, a big kind of lump. I was kind of worried it would affect the canoe trip. And I remember just untying the clothesline when we were breaking camp on morning 3 of the trip. And all of a sudden, there was a pop. And my thumb, still to this day, I can hitchhike with this one. But this thumb, it's like I'm always lighting a Bic or something. I can't go any more than that. So I snapped the tendon, but I could still hold the paddle and portage a canoe. So it was all good. It's all about perspective. So early on in the trip, right away, things aren't going that great. And the Churchill was pretty rainy for us. And usually to kind of gauge out my trips, I always, no matter what, if I'm doing a trip and I'm going upstream, downstream, across lakes, I always average in 40K a day minimum average overall for my trips. And it always seems to at least end up being that. So 1,800K divided by 40, 45 days, okay, let's go with that. And so in order to do that, you're moving 10 hours a day. So I go 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. consistently every day. But then you're not always ending up at a nice, beautiful, rocky sunset campsite. You're ending up in something like this, always like scrabbling out in the brush, at least on the Churchill. But with camping on a canoe trip, once you get your kitchen set up and your tent set up, it's kind of like home. And it doesn't matter how hard the conditions are. And a new bit of technology here, you can't really see as well in the dark, but this right here, I'd never used an inReach messenger before on my journeys. I usually just will bring a PLB, personal locator beacon, in case the life or limb is affected on a trip. I like to kind of disappear, cut myself off from society and just go into the trip. But Sean had agreed to do this trip with me 6 months before we left. But then 3 months before we left, he got into a serious relationship with a woman on the West Coast. And part of the stipulation was that he had to text her every night from the journey. So, and of course, in a 45-day journey, you can imagine, it seems like it's going to be great. But then I became privy to this kind of entertaining soap opera every evening as he would be text arguing with his girlfriend over various issues as he slowly toggled there for an hour. And I would be doing the camp thing and I would just hear the whole drama. So it kind of added an extra layer of adventure to the adventure. The Churchill is a well-traveled river. The local First Nations folks will have their aluminum motorboats, and they build these elaborate, portage ramps, which also work great with a fully loaded T4MX canoe. And Sean, of course, having not done any whitewater canoeing before, is a good way in the warm waters of the Churchill to kind of, run him through some scenarios. And as you can see, he enjoyed himself. So, adventurous soul, attitude is everything, no problem. So we did the Churchill Reindeer, getting up into Reindeer Lake. And Reindeer Lake, the name comes traditionally as kind of the wintering grounds of the caribou herds would come in from the north. And Downs went through this way. He kind of joined in the Churchill on the Frog portage and went across Reindeer up to the Cochrane, as did we. And it was quite different. Like the water in the Churchill and the Reindeer is quite murky. It's warm. Once you hit Reindeer, though, it's very crystal clear, like beautiful water. See like 50, 60 feet, straight down, crystal clear. You got to go underwater a few shots, and it was cold water, but that's what it's all about. But it was also, we did it in 4 days, really hot days. You get your classic kind of thunderclouds, on the horizon by mid-afternoon. You'd have to pull off when the lightning storm came over for 20 or 30 minutes, but then you're always treated, of course, to a beautiful, sunset in the evening. So a good way to get Sean easing into the journey. And of course, getting our camp systems going. Usually, in order to kind of stretch, I do use a gas stove about half the time, like MSR Whisperlight. But the other half of the time, I'll stretch it out with fire. And we'll do the coffee and the oatmeal in the morning. We have lunches now. Sean got lucky, and then freeze dried or fish. We catch some fish in the evening. Also like to use my own use what's on the land for my tea in the evening. So there's a great book, gives great information on traditional uses of a lot of the plants in the boreal forest. So we'll have every evening with a bit of brown sugar, some like Labrador tea, some spruce tip tea, mint tea, rose hip tea, tamarack tea, all these great teas. Sometimes blend them all together, get crazy. But so all part of the experience in the boreal forest. And now things are getting trickier. We're getting towards kind of the difficult part of the trip, the upstream. We have to work our way up the Cochrane River here, through Lac Brochet, and then into this thing I'll call the Mystery Move later on. So the Cochrane River is the same place that PG Downs traveled. And Brochet is our only resupply. So it took us 15 days to get to Brochet, and I carried 45 days worth of freeze-dried food, dinners, and then we resupplied with, lunch, breakfast and snacks in Brochet at the old Northern store. And the Cochrane, beautiful river. PG Downs and his partner, they actually poled up most of these sections, and they made amazingly fast time, I must say. I question it almost, but we basically just paddled and dragged up the eddies and corners, got intimate with the willows, as you do going upstream, but eventually made it to Brochet. And right away, these two Dene kids, so Lac Brochet is a Dene First Nation village. The Dene have an amazing canoeing history and tradition. They're the people that Downs mostly traveled with when he was up there. And at his time in the 1930s, they actually were still all over the land in the summertime, hunting, fishing, going all the way up to the Nunavut border and back. And these kids immediately met us, showed us where the Northern store was, asked us for our chocolate, all that sort of thing. And we walked into town, so they showed us around, and we actually met this guy called Augustine. And Augustine is a member of the Dene Drummers. They kind of travel everywhere and put on performances, all over Canada. And he asked us where we came from. I said, "Oh, we came by canoe." He said, "Oh, that's great." He said, "That's our tradition." But he says, "No one in this town canoes anymore. People don't really get very far past the ends of the lake. It's a part of our tradition. It's a tradition we know, but it's kind of been lost to us." And so the kids followed us back to the Northern store. You can see how comfortable these kids are in this canoe. Just kind of like it's like a feather bed for them. They just kind of belong there. But I asked the kids, "So you guys go canoeing a lot?" And they said, "Actually, this is the first time we've ever sat in a canoe." These kids, 7 and 9 years old, with this great canoeing tradition. And PG Downs actually spoke of this. He saw this kind of transition in the 1930s during the 10 years he traveled there. And a quote from his book says, "It occurred to me that outboard engines are more of a curse than a benefit to the North. In a brief 10 years' time, they have swept the country like wildfire. No self-respecting Indian would think of going any distance without his motor, and these were at one time the finest canoemen in the North." So technology, brought in by trading and that sort of thing, also kind of affected, the First Nations' kind of connection to the land beyond the communities that they were starting to settle in at the time. But the people there were extremely friendly, of course. One thing, if you guys have, of course, traveled north, people will give you the shirt off their back, incredibly open and generous. This is Ashley and Ernest, a couple of guys we talked to in town, and they had actually left and came back from their fishing nets, and a whole mess of pike or jackfish and whitefish, and is Ashley offering us our whitefish for dinner. So great people, salt of the earth. Can't say enough about the people of Brochet. So traveling further up the Cochrane now, away from the town, through a few portages and dragging upstream, we started actually camping in these very obviously old settled areas that used to be used. You can see here these old kind of, I can't quite see it, but there's like a log cut here. They can see all these log cuts sunk into the moss, so people had used these. And at the time, Downs described coming upon these encampments of several dozen Dene people. You can imagine at the time, dozens of tents set up here, and we kind of experienced the same and camped along the places that people don't travel as much anymore. And now is the mystery move. So when you're kind of hooking up two distinct trips into one, you couldn't find any information on this one particular area. And it always involves getting up to a divide. So there's a little lake called Newnham Lake, and most other lakes aren't really named on the maps between here. And so we basically have to work our way up to Newnham and then down into Casbah and the start of the Kazan River up in Nunavut. And kind of a grim, kind of buggy campsite in a burn to start. And of course, the creek we had to go up was log jammed. So we started off with like about a half a kilometer bushwhack portage with all our weight. There's kind of holes in the ground everywhere too, because the river was kind of flowing under the roots. So we had to watch out not to get a broken leg. And then once we got into the river, quite narrow, grinding in through the edges, and often it would close up with a bit of a log jam. We'd have to get into the bush and make our one way through. No portage trails here, just kind of really grinding. This is kind of, the entryway to get into the Kazan, and things getting narrower and narrower and narrower. But of course, in these trips, you do these, this is real adventure. This is where you don't know what's around the corner. There's no kind of, reference to tell you what's going to be at the next lake, how difficult it's going to be. And that's kind of traveling in the old ways. People back in the day didn't necessarily know what was around the corner. And that's kind of the mystery and the wonder of it all. And coming out of one of these areas, we kind of named the lakes because they weren't named the maps by their shape. Anyone, what does this look like to someone? What kind of shape is that? Ghost? You got a ghost there? So we call this Casper Lake. It's official, Casper Lake. And right on Casper Lake, we stayed on this little island here called Ghost Island. And so we came on to Casper Lake not knowing what to expect, and it was absolutely just gorgeous. Like perfect, boreal forest, crystal clear water. This one rock island in the middle had really high ground, beautiful view. No sign of anyone having camped there. But of course, indigenous First Nations people would use this route for centuries, but now it's been kind of reabsorbed, by the wilderness. And it was kind of like a good omen, like a beautiful spot to kind of land a real treat along the way. And afterwards, we got like 10K of really beautiful kind of upstream paddling on an easy meandering creek. We thought, okay, we got this thing nailed. And then, of course, it turned into this. So this is where you really test out that T4MX material. You just leave everything in the canoe and just drag it over the rocks. Don't even bother unloading it. And it actually held up really well. It slid over beautifully. And so we had a couple of days of this, just working our way up to this kind of last few lakes before the divide to Newnham Lake. And along the way, saw this old eagle's nest in this little high point in the rock. So being curious, of course, I crawled up into the nest, up just to nest, see what was inside. It wasn't old, I figured it was abandoned, nothing in there. But it had been taken over by some terns. This little tern chick hiding, Mr. Commando, they're like Rambo here. But just on the other side of the nest, I saw his brother or sister just pop over the other side and boom, into the water. So they're flightless, no way can get back in, so I feel quite bad. So I went and I got the little fella. He was just swimming around down here, and I just picked him up to place back in the nest up there, being a kind fella. And within about 30 seconds of that, his parents came back, and I'm fending them off here with my arm as they're attacking me because I have their child in my hand. And so I did manage to get the little tern back in there, and then they chased us for the next kilometer all the way to the end just to make sure we weren't going to come back. And I think that kind of just led us into this horrible series of portages we called the Devil's Portages, which is just, swamp, no trails, often sinking up to, your waist in this kind of muck, and just kind of navigating by compass in a cloud of black flies. It was Sean waist deep at one point with a pack in his back in the muck. So that was kind of our trial by fire. But we finally did, get to Newnham Lake. We finally thought, finally, downstream time. It's going to be easy all the way now. And this is the downstream, of course. So now we're just dragging and lining downstream, as you do. So the adventure just never ceased. So we're going quite slowly. You start to get worried in these kind of periods, like maybe I'm not going to average 40K a day on this trip, because we were going, 15, 20. I think one day, that day particularly about 10K maybe. And of course, then the river started to speed up and narrow, lots of log jams, dragging just slowly pumping it through the alders again and again and again. And our final kind of campsite was the most miserable probably I've ever had. Here we are looking quite happy as we're being attacked by, mosquitoes. I would make a game of killing, a dozen at a time, and 2 dozen would land, kill two dozen more. It's like, I'm making a difference. I'm making a difference. I'm making a difference. But they would just keep on going. And then this is actually the next morning. They're kind of completely surrounding the tent, and I just rubbed my hand on the nylon. They got crushed between the fly and the nylon of the nylon body of the tent, and they got kind of a nice art piece, but they got completely impregnated into the nylon tent. This is like now 2 years ago, and every time I set the tent up, those guys are still in there. They've become part of the fabric of the tent. So every time I set that up, I'm reminded of this particular campsite. And this is Sean. Of course, the next morning got to deal with him again, taking down the tent. But that was our final, Trials of Job kind of gauntlet. And we did get to Casba Lake the next day and the source of the Kazan River. And so the first section of the Kazan, we actually spent, at one point there was, see down here is like the joining of the borders. We actually spent, in about an hour and a half, we were in Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut in the same trip, just because of the conjunction of the borders there. So that was pretty cool. So through basically Casba Lake, and then into the proper Kazan here. And the Enadai Lake's an important lake to notice because that's where tree line is. That's where you really start to break fully away from the boreal forest right into the barren grounds. And the book for this half of the trip, some people say it's fiction, but I read it a long time ago. And it really kind of got me hooked into the idea of visiting the Kazan and made me aware of the Caribou Inuit people that used to live along it. And of course, the caribou herds, the deer that still exist there. And that's one big reason we went up there to hopefully see caribou and see some of the big wildlife, and also see signs of the indigenous people that used to live there. This is the kind of east side of Casba Lake, beautiful, sandy, calm. We had about a day and a half of good travel there until we get hit by a big windstorm where we were just treadmilling. And we had 15K to go to get to the entrance of the Kazan proper. And we tried to go and we were just kind of backwards. So we had to, actually, I've been lucky, I guess, but this was the first day in 1,000 days of canoe tripping that I actually had to sit for a full day, waiting out this kind of a 40-hour windstorm or whatever it was before it died down. And so we're tucked in the lee here, hanging out in the tent, and we found out, we actually said, does that inReach have a weather function? And we said, yeah, let's try it out. And it said, well, the next morning at 4 a.m. it was going to start to ease. And we said, okay, well, let's go with the inReach. So we just kind of hung out, enjoyed the day. We played a little bit of bocce on the tundra. I think I beat Sean 2 out of 3 games. Sean, if you're hearing me, it's true. Found some caribou antlers, so hopefully good sign of things to come. And sure enough, the next morning things eased, and we got on to the Kazan. So very nice kind of read and run, grade 2-ish, maybe some 3 rapids in there, getting us into Enadai Lake. And of course, now you see the trees are gone. We're now in the barren grounds. And also you see, of course, the signs of the caribou trail. Sean's having lunch over there. And these, of course, are interlaced all over the landscape up there. And so hopefully we're going to see some. And sure enough, that evening, large caribou just swam literally right across to our campsite and walked in front of it. So said, go this way. We're all down here. And so that's where we went. And this is like the best place on the Kazan to see lots and lots of caribou. Over here in this whole area over here to the east is the Kiminurjuak caribou herd, 350,000 strong at the last census. And they had the calves probably about a week or 2 before we got there, and they all kind of travel west in their migration. And this is the narrowest part of the Kazan, so there's a good chance of us seeing them in this area. As Farley Mote says, they're the lifeblood of the land. They sustain the Caribou Inuit for thousands of years and still sustain a lot of the animals that are up there. And so this is the narrow part of the Kazan, just cruising down. And sure enough, within a couple hours, we started seeing groups of 50 to 100 over about 3 or 4 days, just crossing and crossing and crossing. In all these narrows, like right in front of our canoe. You can see the young are with the adults, so not very old, just a week or 2 old, swimming across. And then, at lunchtime, they just come right across in front of our canoe. They're just on a mission, just traveling and just kind of, thundering off across the land and kind of re-impressing all those old caribou trails that they've used for thousands of years. There's my tripping hand. I don't know if anyone else has a problem here, but my hands just fall apart within 2 weeks of canoe tripping. The wet-dry cycle, they'd start to crack and bleed like crazy. So I have to kind of, moisturize every evening, in the tent just to keep them going. I don't like to paddle with gloves, so they just are a complete mess. But within usually a day or two of stopping a trip, they instantly kind of heal. It's kind of like I just get these old man hands. Soon they'll be permanently like that year-round, I'm sure. So we'd seen caribous for days, and after you see caribou, every day, all these caribous, it's kind of like seeing squirrels in Toronto. It's kind of like, oh, there's a caribou, and there's a squirrel. It's kind of the same thing after a while with all this caribou. So whenever we saw something coming across, we barely made any more note of it. But then we saw this creature kind of swimming quite quickly across in front of us, and it kind of saw us and turned towards us, and there's the distinct little ears of a barren ground grizzly just swimming right in front of our canoe. And so once he saw us, he was like, ooh, and he just kind of bolted hard for shore, just swimming really fast in kind of one smooth movement, kind of jumped up onto the rock, and then he burst across the barren ground kind of away from us. But then he kind of, after 50 feet, said, what am I running for? It's like, and he kind of turned around and had a good little look at us and just kind of settled down. We kind of just watched him. And we'll see if this video works. There he is walking. And they're quite large, and it doesn't seem to be a lot of food for them, but they actually get most of their protein from ground squirrels. Little ground squirrels are everywhere, and they just kind of sniff them out and pull them out of the ground and eat them like popcorn. So that's kind of how they kind of sustain themselves. They'll also opportunistically get caribou calves and muskox calves and stuff like that, but always great to see a big, powerful creature like that in the wild. And of course, our protein we got from fish along the way. Easy supplementation. Throw a line into any eddy line in the Kazan, and you'll get like a nice big, lake trout or a grayling. So easy supplementation of fishing on the Kazan. And then of course the people, the Caribou Inuit, the Iqaluit who used to live there. Any kind of flat spot, obvious camping spot, you're going to see these old tent rings. Sometimes small ones, sometimes really big ones. And of course, lots and lots of Inuksuks all over the land. This one here almost looks like, to me, looks like a mother and a child, kind of a high point on 30 Mile Lake. So, really, really strong reminders of the people that lived there for thousands of years, sustaining themselves in such a harsh environment, and really big Inuksuks too. Lots of these big ones in the high points of the island. So even though the indigenous people are gone, the ghosts are still around. The last of them left in the 1950s, moved to communities like Whale Cove and Baker Lake because of disease, starvation, and that sort of thing. But the ghosts remain. And the Kazan starts to broaden out, so we started doing portage around some of the bigger rapid sets. Sometimes I'll drag the canoe, not just to test the T4MX, but because when it's windy, it's just easier. And here's Yathke Lake. So Yathke Lake is quite an interesting lake. It's mentioned in both Farley Moat's People of Deer, as well as Downs' book, as this lake that would stay frozen year-round. And most of the time, people will go along the north shore here and cut across, but we're trusting the inReach now. It's actually really accurate. And it said it was going to be calm, so we just went right across the middle of the lake on a long crossing. And it was not frozen, as you can see. We were actually just hounded by a cloud. You can see them almost here. These little dots, these are all black flies. And so just to escape the black flies in the heat, we would jump in there every half hour just to refresh ourselves. And then we had this beautiful campsite in the middle of the lake, in this great position when you're in the middle of a vast lake and you're in this little island and you can barely see anything but water around you. And just a bounty of cloudberries to kind of pick, and blueberries, of course, all over this island that we put in our oatmeal with some chocolate in there too, of course, just to supplement along the way. And of course, we're getting used to running rapids here. I didn't really look at any information on the Kazan or rapid reports or scouting reports. I like to kind of see with my own eyes. And you get a little bit confident sometimes. And at one point, I was going along this big rapid, and we were just kind of, I think I may even had my shirt off, not like this. But coming down, we thought, oh, it looks pretty straightforward. And all of a sudden, I hear this roar, and there's like a 50-meter wide, almost river-wide hole in the middle of this river. And so we just kind of turn around upstream and just use hard ferry, slip around the edge, and just get lucky. And just around the bend, we see this broken up canoe on the shore. Pack boats are great for saving money on costs, but in rapids, in some situations, they're maybe not the best. But we found out later, this is from a trip of 4 canoes from a camp, and all 4 of them had probably gone into that because all 4 boats went for a swim. They lost 2 of the 4 boats. No one got hurt, but they never found 2 of them, and this is one of them here. So just a good reminder not to get too lazy there in the rapids which I do sometimes. So the one big creature here we hadn't seen yet was these muskox. We kind of came upon them. The rocks started to move and run around, and they ran for about 10 seconds and then turned around and kind of just stopped and stared at us. We kind of walked up on them and said, wow, there's a lot of them there. Yeah. But so great to see these muskox. And one thing, I was talking to one of the Inuit guys, and they said, actually, the barren ground grizzly have a unique method of hunting muskox. When they have the calves, the bear will come towards it, they'll circle, but the bears they'll know, and they'll charge the circle. The muskox will chicken out and just run everywhere. But the bear, instead of running after the muskox, will just sit there, because the little calves, they have very bad eyesight, and they'll just kind of go for the closest brown thing that's still. So they'll just walk right up to the grizzly bear who's hanging there, is going, lunchtime, you know. So that's another crafty method the barren ground grizzly has of getting food. And of course, I start to look like a muskox at the end of a trip too. Similar facial hair, wild eyes. I'm sure we've all been there before. So the final section of our journey to Baker Lake, of course, you're starting to see more signs of civilization now as you get towards the community, you know, an old skidoo. We even found this big pile, like an old core samples kind of stacked up on the shore here of 30 Mile Lake. So some mining project that probably they forgot to pick up their samples or maybe ran out of money, who knows. But all these kind of signs of civilization as you get. And once you start seeing these signs, it's kind of like a horse to the barn. It's like, we only got a couple days, let's go fast, let's just burn through the rest of this trip. So we're getting around, quick portage around Kazan Falls, but then the big wind comes up. So we had this north wind that just kind of ripped in from Baker Lake, funneled right down the whole river, and made us stop. Made us kind of, sometimes you have to be reminded by nature that you should just chill out and relax a bit, have some soup, do some reading, and really enjoy, where you are in this beautiful, boreal setting. So after about half a day, the wind released us, and we paddled down the rest of the Kazan. And for the first time in 43 days, we actually had a roof over our head. We found this little camp on the edge of Baker Lake, mouth of the Kazan, called Alexander Camp. Very simple, just a plywood shelter with a Coleman stove and a Coleman lantern. But was like, the Holiday Inn or the Taj Mahal to us. Actual mattresses, nice Coleman lantern. So a good way to kind of chill out on our final day before we crossed over Baker Lake, the town of the next day. So Sean had completed his first proper canoe trip. We did a little guitar dance. And then that is all there is to that trip. And I did write a feature article on this for Explore magazine, which came out about half a year ago, called Loss. And if you guys are curious, you can check that out. And I do have actually 5 copies of my most recent article. So just to make sure you guys are paying attention, I'm going to ask 5 questions and come up if you answer it, and I'll give you a magazine, latest article. What's the name of the author of Sleeping Island? Wait, hands. Hands, I need hands. Otherwise everyone's, yes, you. Oh, nice, you got that one. How about, what was the name of the partner I had that I almost starved to death? Hands? First name only. I need a hand. You guys are bad. You two, you're working together. Okay, you got it. What's the name of the indigenous people that live at Lac Brochet? Yes. Yes. Okay. And then let's see. What is the first body of water I lay in a canoe in? This is up on the fly. What's the name of the, this is a good one. What are the name of the 2 kids in the canoe in Lac Brochet? I mentioned them. One of the names the 2 kids. And we give it a shot. Yes. No, not Willie. Yes, in the red, yep. That was one of the dudes who gave us fish. Close. Yes. No, it wasn't Frank. It's kind of like very southern names, almost like they're born in the South. Andrew, not quite. It's the same name as a city in Texas. Yes. Not Jason. Jason is not a city in Texas. Not Austin. Huh. I heard it. Yes. Not Houston. Dallas. Yes. Okay. Thank you guys for listening. Come on and get your magazines afterwards. Yeah.